Hello everybody, this is Countdown VHS. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're doing another hybrid style of video, taking a look at the preview campaign for Total War Wainriders, called currently Wars of the Wainriders, and looking at a faction that we're calling the Western Horde that will appear in this preview campaign as well as in the full version of the mod. And as a reminder, this is a sort of a half map of Middle-earth we're looking at here. This is using essentially the new Shadow map from an earlier release of 4th Age Total War. It covers about half of the Sea of Rune, as you can see, all the way down towards Umbar, and that offers me the opportunity to show a lot of the essential factions and conflicts that were relevant mostly to Gondor during the period of the Wainrider invasions. And the Western Horde does have some backing in the lore. Not the name itself, but the conception of the faction as somewhat separate. Or that is, the idea of the Wainriders consisting of not just one large centralized group of Easterlings, but at least a couple of different factions. You do find in especially the discussion in the essay Rhovanion and Eorl, which you can find in Unfinished Tales, that Tolkien refers to both the Wainriders of Rhovanion and the Eastern Wainriders, and he talks about them in such a way as to suggest that they are not entirely in sync. That at times the Western Wainriders, the Wainriders of Rhovanion, are doing their own thing. They go through their own crises. Meanwhile, the Eastern Wainriders are doing different things. They're involved in different wars, and they don't necessarily coordinate all the time with one another. Certainly, they are two related groups, but they are not unified into a single political entity. That's the interpretation I get from looking at that essay, and I think it fits pretty well with how the wars are presented, both in that essay, Rhovanion and Eorl, and also in the Appendix A for Return of the King. So we're calling them the Western Horde rather than the Wainriders of Rhovanion. This is a naming convention that I believe Webba came up with this, Western Horde and Great Rune as the two names, to sort of suggest that the Wainriders have slightly different emphases in these two factions. The Western Horde seems a little less civilized, perhaps, than the Eastern Wainriders. I think that's because the Eastern Wainriders we see later on in the period assembling this vast army, putting together a coalition of people of Khand as well as the Haradrim. And although that coalition was evidently perhaps brokered by agents of Sauron, nevertheless, the Eastern Wainriders are presented as the senior partner in that coalition. And the masses of men that they are able to bring to bear against Gondor in 1944 is significant. It takes them very much by surprise. And the number of chariots, the number of cavalry, these are troops that Gondor seems not to be expecting, which suggests as well, by contrast, that the earlier Wainriders that they had faced, these are what they would call the Wainriders of Rhovanion, were somewhat easier of a foe, potentially. After all, they did beat the Wainriders of Rhovanion in the Battle of 1899. Although it was not necessarily a decisive victory from a strategic standpoint, Gondor was able to defeat them. And they were not necessarily overwhelmed in the way that the 1944 battle against the Eastern Wainriders is described. From a few other pieces of evidence, we've conceived of the Western Horde as maybe resembling a slightly more Hunnic, a more tribal group that takes into itself different subjugated peoples, Northmen of Rhovanion in particular, in this mod at any rate, while the Eastern Wainriders have maybe a slightly more advanced military system. They've got access to a little more chariots, at least in this version of the mod. They've got easier access to chariots at any rate. They've also got just a higher tier armor as a general rule. So we're going to take a look at the starting position of the Western Horde in this video, and I also want to use this as an opportunity to talk about Rhovanion, particularly that portion of Rhovanion between the Anduin, between the Ered Lithwi, between the Sea of Rune and the Kelduin and Mirkwood, right? That area that we tend, or at least I tend to think of mostly as Rhovanion. That is the area of Vidugavia, king of Rhovanion, right? Or the so-called king of Rhovanion, as we can read about in Appendix A. So in this video, I want to talk about obviously the mod a little bit, but we're also going to do a bit of a lore ramble about Rhovanion and about maybe what we can glean from its history and the different levels of occupiers who passed through and made it their own. Here we are on the campaign map. This is the initial capital for the Western Horde faction, and as you can see, they don't have too many settlements to start, but the ones they do have are fairly large regions, which is somewhat of a blessing and a curse, right? On the one hand, it means that you can have a bit of advance warning as an enemy approaches you before they put you under siege. But on the other hand, it means that distance to capital penalties will accrue as you start to expand beyond your initial borders. There are some neighboring rebel settlements to try to grab up here in the southern fringes of Mirkwood. And of course, way over here near the Anduin, it's the lone single village of the Aothiad. This is the remnant of the Northmen who your immediate predecessors, the Wayne Riders of Rhovanion, you have driven them from this territory and taken everything except this little node. However, the fighting is not all over here. If you're playing as the Western Horde, you'll notice that initially you will have this battle to fight. This is to represent what became known in the lore as the Battle of the Plains. This is a battle fought in 1856 between Narmakil II, the king of Gondor, Marhari, who is the leader of the Aothiad, and the Wayne Riders, of course, who would later be known as the Wayne Riders of Rhovanion, and again in this mod, the Western Horde. In this battle, Narmakil is killed, and his army was only saved from total destruction, we are told, by the valor of Marhari, who fell in the rear guard action. So the remnants of the army of Narmakil were able to retreat over Daggerlad and back into Ithilien. There's not much detail about this particular battle. I've decided to place it here partly because we are told that the Battle of the Plains takes place south of Mirkwood, that Narmakil II assembles a great army and sends it north into Rhovanion in the plains south of Mirkwood. That's about as specific as it gets. I figure the battle ought to have taken place somewhere south-ish, right? So not very close to Mirkwood, because otherwise I would assume that if the battle took place like up here, they would be more likely to retreat west over the Anduin, right, over the Undeeps potentially, and get into Kalanarthon, which at this point is held by the men of Gondor. So we've set up here. Also, the other reason is just when you generate the battle map, this area seems like a pretty good place to fight. So that I'm just happy with how that works out. Now, in terms of the battle, you've got two stacks here. You've got your faction leader, who is essentially the chief of the Western Horde, and he commands a largely cavalry force, so it's 50-50. The bodyguard here is Waynes, as well as you've got some war Waynes alongside. And then you've got 4 units of horse archers and 4 units of steppe lancers. So you've also got some decent infantry, but a real key is using your cavalry correctly, and then also managing the reinforcements. You will want those reinforcements to show up on the battlefield, and you have got a couple of approaches, right? Like you could attack the Aothiad first, and have the Gondor's forces show up as reinforcements, or you could attack Gondor immediately and have the Aothiad show up as reinforcements. They've got a mix of cavalry and infantry, so it's not entirely cav. This is to represent the forces that Narmakil gathered to himself of the scattered forces of the retreating Northmen as he marched northward with his army and tried to assemble something of a resistance to the Wayne Riders. So this is not necessarily a decisive arm in the hands of the AI, but it can be an annoyance to deal with. Fortunately, in your reinforcement stack, you've got a couple of units of Waynes. You've got some horse archers, mostly infantry, though. But your infantry is pretty strong. You've got, I want to point out, I've got some unit cards for this Eastland Swords unit, thanks to Majestic Steerv, who have volunteered to put these together for me, as well as a few other unit cards that had been missing. And so this is a quite strong little unit, can stand toe-to-toe with some Gondorian forces, certainly the lower tier swordsmen. Another unit that I'm particularly fond of, this is the Horde Spearmen. This is just the vanilla Spearmen of Rune, essentially, from the New Shadow, but I always liked the aesthetic of this unit. Gave him a war cry. I've still got to determine who's going to actually get this ability across all of the factions, but I like the idea that this might be a more aggressive spear unit. They're not just there to take a charge and not fight. That they could be more aggressive. But really, the heavy lifters, in terms of the infantry anyway, are going to be your Wayne Rider Chieftains. This is a high tier unit, and they are quite expensive. But their javelins, their axemen, war cry. Reasonable morale is quite good, actually, for this mod. So they've got a lot of durability, and the ability to throw javelins is, of course, very, very important for them. You also get some archers, Easterling warriors. I just love the look of this unit. Very sort of Hunnic, right? Sort of Eastern Asian or Central Asian steppe flavor to them, which seems very fitting. And then you've got a mounted version in your Easterling horse archers, which these guys double as very solid cavalry melee units as well. Probably the not super effective ones would be these steppe lancers. These are in some ways a bit of a throwaway unit. You certainly want to take advantage of their charge bonus, but there may not be a lot of them left after the battle. So you use them for those charges, preferably charges against cav or against the rear of an enemy or against very light troops. They're going to be quite effective there. They're reasonably cost effective compared to the horse archers or some of your infantry, for example. But they're not the best, right? They don't have quite the armor level or quite the defensive capability to stand up like the Easterling horse archers do with that 19 defense. So those are the general units you're going to be using. Let's take a look, though, at what else you can get as the Western Horde. So you've got a fairly typical technology tree here. You've got your barracks. At the first tier, you're going to get steppe axes and tribute huntsmen. So you've got, at several tiers, a sort of native Wayne Rider unit and then a Northman style unit. And the idea behind this faction very early on, we determined would be a kind of a hybrid, right? It's sort of to represent what happened as the Huns moved into Europe and gathered to themselves these different tribes. So there were Goths in their armies, right? There were Gepids, there were all these other groups that I'm remembering at the moment. But they had lots of they sort of assembled an empire, and it was a matter not so much of conquest of land per se, although that was involved as well, but it was a conquest of loyalty, you might say, a conquest of the elites of the other Germanic tribes or the tribes that were in the areas that they conquered. And so they grew stronger as a result of that. And I like that that's reflected in the Western Horde. So these are going to give you some more javelin units. This is just a low-tier skirmish unit, but very useful, right? Javelins are very useful, especially against the forces of Gondor with their armor. At tier 2, at the barracks, this is where you're going to get your tribute spears, which is a more solid line unit, I guess you could say. The steppe axes have a bit lower defense, decent attack, but the tribute spears are going to be able to hold the line a little bit better. And this is where you also get your Eastland swords, just a very strong all-around unit. This, by the way, is another difference between the Western Horde and the Eastern Wayne Riders in this mod. I've made a lot of their units available at a tier lower for the Western Horde. So steppe axes are a tier 1 unit for the Western Horde, but for the Eastern Wayne Riders, these guys are tier 2. Similarly, Eastland swords are tier 3 for the Eastern Wayne Riders. And what that is intended to reflect, I suppose, is that moving into this new territory, although this horde is something of, perhaps more barbaric, maybe a little less settled than the Eastern Wayne Riders, it would also consist of the most adventuresome or warrior-inclined individuals among the Wayne Riders. So in the Eastern Wayne Rider territories, that faction, the Eastern Wayne Riders, will be able to train low-tier warband at tier 1, and then they'll get their steppe axes at tier 2, the Eastland swords at tier 3, and so on. At the higher level, the Eastern Wayne Riders are going to have some very, very strong units, but at those lower levels, it's going to be, the low-tier stuff that's in the area. But moving into a new land, fighting successfully against the Northmen, who've been allies of Gondor for centuries at this point, and even holding their own against Gondor in these early wars, I think that warranted having the Western Horde be a bit stronger in its infantry at any rate than the Eastern Wain Riders. Okay, so going on to Tier 3, what do you get? This is where you get those Horde Spearmen, and then you get Easterling Warriors. So this is your first dedicated archer unit in the infantry, and it's Tier 3 at the barracks. You don't have a super great ranged option before this point. You do have the Huntsman for a sort of a short range, but the Bowmen are going to come from either this unit or mercenaries that you can find in the area. We'll talk about those in a minute if I remember. And then at the 4th tier, High Chieftains Barracks, this is where you get those the Wain Rider Chieftains. So this is the highest tier infantry unit available to you. And again, fantastic unit all around. So as far as the stables go, not a whole lot. You are going to get most of your cavalry from another building. At the stables, this is where you, as well as the Eastern Wain Riders, are going to get your chariot units. And for the Western Horde, I thought it was appropriate that they had fewer chariot options than the Eastern Wain Riders. As they move into this new territory, chariots seem very strange to the people of Gondor. It's notable that these Wain Riders fight in chariots. Their chieftains fight in chariots at any rate. And so that suggests to me that maybe the Western Horde had fewer chariots than the Eastern Wain Riders, of whom we are told that when they invade, just the massive chariots is unexpected. But also, I can imagine the Western Horde, they come into Rhovanion in 1851. They start their conquest. They defeat Gondor 1856. And then they're there, 1899, another 40 years rolls around. They're defeated by Gondor, but they stay in the area. And they're never evicted, essentially. 1944, the Eastern Wain Riders are defeated in Ithilien, and there's no reconquest of Rhovanion. It's one of the sort of themes that we'll come to in this video. But for the Western Horde, it seems to me that we don't hear about their chariot use very much. So initially, they've got some, right? Their bodyguards are going to be chariot units, but they're not going to have quite so many. In fact, they're going to have war wains. That's going to be Tier 2 in your homelands. And then that's it, right? So you're going to get war wains. Now, it's still useful to build stables because, as you can see, these have an increasing law bonus, 5, 10, and 15%. That's also true for the barracks, right? You're going to get increasing law bonuses there. But it's not something you feel like you need to build to the highest level. Okay, in addition to those barracks buildings, you're going to get the typical thing, traders, you're going to get smiths, you're going to get places of healing for population growth, same thing with farms, roads. Wain Riders are also going to get the execution square for a basic quick law bonus, 10% wherever you are, so that's very handy. You're going to get the Hall of Drinking and the Hall of Feasts for some happiness bonuses. Not too much else going on with those buildings, but it can be useful in your outlands. But the more interesting building for these factions is the migration buildings, the camps, and the settlements. So at your Tier 3 for your settlement, for the minor city, you can build Easterling camps. No prerequisites there, at least currently. And this is where you're going to get some trade bonuses, a population growth bonus, and steppe lancers. So that's where this cavalry unit comes from. This represents the Wain Riders essentially bringing in different tribes, nomadic steppe tribes, and that's where their cavalry is going to be. The second tier of this building is at the highest level, so the population growth for this building, the camps, is going to be useful into getting you to the large city level. That brings another population growth bonus, which can be a bit of a double-edged sword, because as population increases, you have more potential for unrest. But this is where you are going to get your Easterling horse archers. So very much worth it. But the idea is these are a sort of a military/economic building, which seems kind of fitting for how the Wain Riders presumably would live. So this is where your cavalry is going to come from. The thing about this currently is that these are buildable anywhere, and so it's not limited to your homelands. And so I think similarly this nicely reflects the idea that the Wain Riders, both the Eastern Wain Riders and these guys, the Western Horde, are able to recruit these nomadic units just anywhere. And so their chariots are not necessarily going to follow them everywhere. You know, you may conquer lands in Gondor where you cannot train your war wains, for example, in theory. But you could train, you could build some settlements, get some camps, and get some steppe lancers and horse archers. So a bit of an advantage there. But you also are going to get city development. And the buildings here are shared between the Western Horde and Great Rune. So you and the Eastern Wainriders are going to get all the same buildings here. But there are going to be some slight differences in terms of the results. So the first one of these is the Thrall Stockade. This is just like what you may remember from Dominion of Men or the New Shadow. You need a market square, which I believe is the highest level of trader building. And this is going to give you a series of bonuses, improvements to construction times, the farming level of trade income. Happiness takes a hit, as you would expect, because you're running a slave economy, essentially. The cattle trader is a great building, but unfortunately there's not a lot of cattle in this area. The kine are associated with the Sea of Rune, and so they're mostly in the east. You can see they're around here, right? So the faction of Great Rune has the easiest access to the cattle trader building, which really helps them pump up their economy. But you, the Western Horde, don't get it unless you conquer here. I put a token cow up here into the, I guess, the southern Rhovanion province here. And so this is going to be the easiest place for you to get some very nice economy going. It's also got a port. Initially, you just got to beat some Northmen, and then you can have access to the cattle trader. Of course, if you want to get more cattle trade, you can move into the east and try to take over from your brothers, the Eastern Wainriders. Third option for you is fortified camps. This is going to require Easterling settlements, so it's that second level of like the camp buildings. And this is going to get you some units that can be used in a couple of different ways. The settler wains are basically population units. They exist to take population from one province and move it to another province. So you train a unit of settler wains, and I believe it's set to 1 unit per turn, and that takes out 120 population from the settlement. And then you can move it somewhere and disband the unit, and that adds that same number of men to the settlement where it was disbanded. So you can train up a bunch of these. Just if you want to get a fortified camp somewhere, it's going to be a building with a decent amount of it's going to be a settlement with a decent amount of population and population growth, because it's going to require that you're at that highest level. And you can just train settler wains all day and then send those settlers out to the settlements that you're conquering, that you want to build up quickly and disband. This is the type of building that only benefits the player. The AI is not going to make good use of its settler wains if it decides to build them. But regardless, they do exist. They're going to have very little utility in combat. And fortunately, I don't see the AI making them very much. That's right. So they're not going to just fill up the recruitment queue of the AI. But it'll be an option for essentially for the player. You may see a few of them here or there, but it doesn't detract too much from what the AI would otherwise do. The other unit is Swordwives, and this is to reflect what we read about in Kirion and Eorl, the best source for the Wainriders historically. And in that essay, we're told that there was a rebellion, a revolt, caused in part by desperate outlaws bursting out of the forest. So these are Northmen in the employ of the Eotheod, who move out of the forest and basically stir up the slaves, many of whom would be Northmen or descendants of Northmen, or maybe even just thralls who were brought from the east or descendants of those. And the slaves set fire to the camps of Wains, but we were told that the victory was not assured, that this rebellion stalled. It was not totally successful because although the main army of the Wainriders had been lured south to fight King Kalimetar of Gondor, again, year 1899, and that army was defeated, the rebellion, although it broke out, could not make a substantial amount of progress due to the presence of several other inhabitants who were left behind. These are not warriors by trade, but they were, the old men, the youths, and young women who, in that people, we are told, in the Wainriders, were trained in the use of arms and the defense of their homes and families. And so it's a very interesting little tidbit. Tolkien has a few of these references to warrior women, or Amazons as he calls them, in the context of the First Age and Haleth. But this is one of them. This is one of the earlier references, and some people have seen in this tradition potentially the beginning of the tradition of shield maidens, right? That we hear about in Rohan with reference to Eowyn. She uses the term shield maiden, I think, twice in the books. And so it could have been that the Northmen maybe learned that habit from the Wainriders. Sort of an interesting idea, because again, they shared a border with them for, you know, something like a century, and honestly more, because while the 1944 battle in Ithilien signaled the end of the threat of the Wainriders to Gondor, and essentially the end of the Wainrider, you know, dominance from Anduin, you know, into the far east, it was not the end of the Wainrider presence. Right, the Easterlings continue to live around here. So even after Eorl came out of the north and took over, you know, Calenardhon and turned it into Rohan, essentially, they, you could argue, shared a border with the Easterlings, with the descendants of the Wainriders, and that's something like 700 years in the future. Okay, so the fortified camps, they give you a population unit and then a real unit. The Swordwives in this mod are a unit that uses bows and swords, and so they're primarily an archer, but got some melee capability as well. And then finally, vassal estates. You can build this anywhere. This gives a law bonus, and it allows recruitment of vassal units in most lands outside of Gondor. This is the specialization building that differs the most depending on which Wainrider faction you're playing. So for the Wainriders of the East, the Great Rune faction, they are going to get more use of this in Khand. They're going to get some Khandian-style units, some elephant units. We talked about that in a previous video. But for the Wainriders of Rhovanion, or the Western Horde, you are going to get mostly Northmen units, and that's going to be available to you here as well as in Calenardhon, I believe. I set it up so that if you built vassal estates here, you could essentially train or invite better, more skilled, more elite Northmen-style units. So you're going to get some more robust cavalry, primarily, as well as, you know, a few other little treats. So the vassal estates are going to be a useful building for you to build, and depending on where you build it, you'll get some different stuff. So that is essentially the buildings that you have available, with one exception, and that is the alignment buildings. So like a few other factions on the map, the Western Horde does have the option of building both Ways of Darkness style temples, if you will, or memorials, as well as building Sauronic specific temples or memorials. Now, unlike in the East, if you're playing in Rune, if you're playing in Khand, building the High Temple of the Shadow in those places will get you some cult-specific units. This is the Iron Tower Warriors if you are in Rune or Khand, and the Iron Tower Cavalry if you are in Khand. If you are in the West, for playing the Western Horde, this has a little less utility, but if you take provinces in Mirkwood, you can get up to the point where you can get a special cultic style unit there. It's going to be very different in theme. This is a two-handed axe unit. The idea is that Sauron is present in Dol Guldur, right, during the time frame of the mod. He's not off in the east. He is essentially hiding out in Dol Guldur. And so I thought it would be cool if you get some Sauron-specific units by taking territory in southern Mirkwood, right? Something that would be somewhat fitting. It's not a super flashy, fancy unit, but it's going to give you some nice bonuses. Having a two-handed armor-penetrating axe unit is going to be very helpful, because you don't really have anything like that in your regular roster. But of course, there are going to be challenges with getting up to this level of culticness. That's going to bring some unrest penalties, but that is what you can attempt to manage with all of the other law buildings and happiness buildings that you have at your disposal. One other thing we could talk, I guess, about mercenaries, but I guess I didn't set them up to be available. Let me just double check. Is there anything outside? Yes. Okay, we do have some. Okay, so in the area of Rhovanion, not over here apparently, but everywhere else, you can get some Rhovanion mercenaries. This is a bow and axe unit. that is essentially sort of modeled after a somewhat roughly armed, like Viking traders, I guess you could say. The idea behind these guys is that they are, moving through the area. Maybe they were, mercenaries. Maybe they were just bands of outlaws. Maybe they were traders. Who knows? But these guys have some utility because, as we've seen, the Wayne Riders of Rhovanion, the Western Horde, is limited in its archery. So this is actually a pretty useful unit. They're not the best in terms of defense or melee ability, but they do have that option, and they've got bows. And you have a more up-armored version of these guys over here in Rhovanion. Let me see if I can get someone over here. Yes, very nice looking Variag traders. So we've got some armor, sort of an upgrade of the Rhovanion mercenary unit that you just saw, but clear metal helmet, bow, axe. Very, very nice unit. Very expensive, but much more capable in a melee. So that'll be a nice region to have because that's the only region you can train these guys. The Variag traders are only going to be available here, and the idea is that they've been trading along the rivers, right? As the Wayne Riders invade, and later the Balkoth invade, we're told that the Northmen who are in the area sometimes flee north across the River Kelduin and merge there with the people of Dale. And so this could represent, some of those Northmen who would make deals with the Easterlings, right? Because it wasn't always 100% war all the time. Okay, I think that just about covers it for the Western Horde in terms of what they can do. Certainly with regards to buildings. In terms of their strategic position, you've only got 4 provinces initially. It is important that you win this battle and get Gondor's army essentially locked down, take out the Aotheod, and then you've got to worry about expenses because the economy is not going to be doing too well initially. So partly this battle is going to be useful as a way for you to clean out some dead wood, right, from your own army, and then decide where you're going to want to go to make some cash. It is helpful to take this, but these provinces are not terribly rich, right? So you've got to sort of make that decision. It might be better to invade over towards here because you've got a nice large town with the cattle resource, meaning that you could get those cattle traders going. You could even go into the hills and take Nerigzagil and beat the outlawed dwarves. This has got some nice resources for you to take as well. So, of course, you could also, once you've cleared this army, if you do better than the historical Wayne Riders did, you might be in a position actually to head down south and take some of these wealthy Gondorian settlements pretty quick. But let's move over to a discussion of the lore, because that is the other thing that I'd like to discuss here today. And again, this is going to take the form of a more casual lore ramble. But the thing that I've been pondering, on a reread of Return of the King recently, is just how long-lived the Easterling presence was in the area of Rhovanion. And again, when we talk about Rhovanion, we can talk about the broad area stretching from the Misty Mountains, right, all the way over to roughly the Sea of Rune, and everything from Mordor north to the Grey Mountains, I guess. But I think for most people, probably this area is what you sort of think of as Rhovanion's core area, because the other parts of it comprise other places that we already know. Like technically, yeah, Mirkwood is Rhovanion, or Rhovanion. Mirkwood is in Rhovanion, right? The Anduin Vales are their own place. Dale is kind of its own place. So the one that's left, right, that isn't any other place really, is this area between basically the Kelduin and Mordor, and between the Sea of Rune and Mirkwood, or the Anduin River. This is an interesting territory to me because it's changed hands clearly over the centuries, and it was once solidly within Gondor's orbit for quite a long time, actually. But there's also this influence from the north, the presence of Northmen, and of course there's also a presence of Easterlings. So looking back over the sort of the history of this particular area, I wanted to sort of see what we can figure out based on the information from like Appendix B, just what information in the Tale of Years and in the other appendices can tell us about the population here. And if you're watching the video, I would also say that at this point, The visuals are probably much less important, right? I'm just sort of talking here, and you don't necessarily need to be looking at the screen to sort of get a gist of what I'm saying. Now, of course, this particular stretch of land has a very long history going way back into the First Age. I don't want to dwell too much on that, or even the Second Age. The Second Age, though, it might be worth mentioning in passing that no doubt there was some influence on this area from the League or the Alliance of the Longbeards and the Men of the North. You can read about that in the essay Of Men and Dwarves. This can be found in The Peoples of Middle-earth, which is volume 12 of the Histories of Middle-earth. Easily, one of my favorite volumes that I've read of that series. It just has some fascinating tidbits, and the of Dwarves and Men is one of the most interesting because it gives us that window into the very little discussed Second Age doings of the Dwarves. So in that period of the Second Age, before Sauron had invaded Rhovanion and mask off and he goes full evil. So that's what, 1600s of the Second Age. Before that period, you had the dwarves, the Longbeard dwarves specifically, with their capital at Khazad-dûm, owning a territory essentially along the eastern slopes of the Misty Mountains, the slopes of the Grey Mountains, and over into the Iron Hills as well. And in that period, basically, we're told that they consider all that territory as somewhat their land, and that there are Northmen living also in that area, sort of in between those 3 points. You might imagine this is sort of a big right triangle with the corner of the triangle up around Mount Gundabad, right? And the Northmen were living in the area. These Northmen, we are told, had a couple of skills that were particularly useful to the dwarves, one being that they produced food. The dwarves did not like producing their own food. Who can blame them, right? The dwarves just liked mining. They liked doing their own crafts. And so they entered into an arrangement with the men whereby the men would provide food for them, and they would return the favor with arming them essentially. And in further return for that service, these Northmen were expected to help defend the dwarven territory, the dwarven realms. No doubt this would have been useful because although the dwarves have obviously a much greater interest in the subsurface parts of their territory than in the overland surface, they did have roads, right? They did have the dwarf road going from Khazad-dûm up towards the Iron Hills, and so it would have been important to them to maintain those trade links because that's just the Longbeards, right? They also had trade with the other houses of the dwarves, which would have been much farther to the east, farther into the west. So having this more mobile surface-dwelling group of people would have been very useful to them. And mobile is the second advantage that the Northmen brought the dwarves, because the Northmen were very skilled riders, we're told, even in the Second Age. This, I believe, is the first mention, first hint that we have of the affinity between Northmen, again, who are obviously famously would be associated with horses in the person of Rohan, right? In that appearance. This is the first appearance of that affinity with these Northmen for horses and cavalry. We're told in particular that they were good horsed archers. I think we can interpret that to mean that they actually shot from horseback. The idea is that when large numbers of orcs would gather in the open, they would send out companies of horsed archers to surround them and slaughter them. So very cool stuff, and very reminiscent of what we see Éomer doing in The Two Towers when he comes upon that company of orcs, camping and holding Merry and Pippin and trying to get back to Isengard. He has horsed archers as well there, and he makes use of them. So the Northmen are around. We're not told precisely where they lived at this time, but we are told that after Sauron attacks, after the dwarves go essentially into isolation mode, that the League is ended essentially, and the men who were left in this area, presumably living somewhere between the Misty Mountains and the Iron Hills, somewhere in that band of territory, the men who survived retreated into the woods, retreated into the hills. So that presumably is the stock from which the later Northmen emerged, including the Northmen of Rhovanion. So I think that we can imagine that in the second half of the Second Age, very dark time for Middle-earth, the Northman culture would have been kept alive only in those isolated communities, perhaps in Mirkwood, perhaps in hills or valleys of the Misty Mountains. Maybe this is the point at which we see the split in population between men of the Vales of Anduin, right? Men of the Misty Mountains from which Bjorn's people may have been descended, right? Maybe at an earlier point they were all descended from these Northmen who were in league with the dwarves, and then after Sauron's attack of the area, they split off into these different groups. Some men settling up on near the northern eaves of the forest and eventually founding Dale much later. Some men sticking around the southern or the Vales of Anduin itself. So at any rate, we have this period in the Second Age where this powerful league between men and dwarves has collapsed. And when do we see Northmen again? Well, it takes quite a while. In the Third Age, the first we hear of the area of Rhovanion is that it seems to be an area through which Easterlings attack Gondor. And this is something we can read about in Appendix A, as well as in the Tale of Years for Appendix B. And this is about a period of 50 years or so, from I think the year 490 to about 540. You've got the first Easterling invasions of Gondor. We're not told where these invasions occur, but we are told that I think it takes a decade before Gondor is able to expel them. So they attack, they occupy some place in Gondor, then they are driven out. Fresh hordes of Easterlings come in and kill the king who has taken the title of Rhovanion I. That's going to be an important title relevant to a later period. Rhovanion, of course, means East Victor, so it becomes an ironic name when he's killed by fresh hordes of Easterlings, a few years later. And that period ends at around 540, I believe, and I think that is where we have the capture or the annexation of broad swaths of territory in what we would now consider to be Rhovanion, right? North of Mordor, east towards the Sea of Rhûn. So that is the territory that Gondor occupies in the 6th century of the Third Age. And again, it's worth considering who's there at the time. It's not Northmen yet. At least it seems like it's not. It seems like this must be a hostile population. Now, that does not necessarily mean it's not Northmen, because, as we will see, Northmen are not completely allied or friendly towards Gondor. There is evidence of hostility, and perhaps the greatest evidence of hostility between Gondor and Northmen can be seen in the Argonath itself, right? We've got these two statues representing the kings with their hands held outward, palms outward in token of warning, and their palms are pointed to warn off the north, right? The warning is not facing east, it's facing north. And in a much later period, so we're talking, I think, 1240 or so, this is when we get the activity of the second Rhovanion II, who was, his actual name is Minalcar. He was made steward by another king, actually, another king whose name will be reused again, and this is Narmakil I. So around the year 1240, Narmakil I, one of the childless kings, I think the second childless king of Gondor. That's a symbol of decay and decline in Tolkien's writing. Childlessness, not a good thing. And so Narmakil I basically hands over the responsibility for ruling to this Minalcar. He becomes regent, not steward. He becomes the regent. And in 1240, we're told in Appendix A that his chief concern is with the Northmen. And let's actually take a look at the relevant passage there. So here's what we have from Appendix A. Minalcar, son of Calmakil, was a man of great vigor, and in 1240 Narmakil, to rid himself of all cares, made him regent of the realm. From that time onwards he governed Gondor in the name of the kings until he succeeded his father. His chief concern was with the Northmen. These had increased greatly in the peace brought by the power of Gondor. So just to break out of the quote here for a moment, The fact that the Northmen were allowed to increase greatly suggests that they had been in a decline, which tracks perfectly well with our picture of them as existing in the latter parts of the Second Age in a much declined, maybe even degenerate sort of state, right? Living in caves, living in the wilderness, in these tiny communities, far fallen from their heights under the alliance of the dwarves. And so as Gondor's borders expanded into the east, expand towards the Sea of Rhûn, we can imagine they gradually creep out of those isolated communities. They realize that there are people who are, somewhat friendly, people you can deal with, and they can move down into this new territory that has been opened up potentially. So this is when I think we can mark the beginning of Northmen settlement of Rhovanion. It's got to be after the 6th century invasions of Gondor, or expansions of Gondor if you prefer, expansions into the east. So to get back to the quote, the kings showed them favor, the Northmen, since they were the nearest in kin of lesser men to the Dunedain, being for the most part descendants of those peoples from whom the Edain of old had come. And they gave them wide lands beyond Anduin, south of Greenwood the Great, to be a defense against men of the east. There we go. So this pinpoints, not precisely in terms of the years, right? Because this is rather vague language. The kings showed them favor. It doesn't say a particular king. So this is probably a process that takes centuries, where the Northmen who have been living in the forest, presumably, or in the vales of the Anduin, in these isolated communities, were invited south. And so where did they dwell? South of Greenwood the Great. Now, to me, that specifies the area of what we would later call the Brown Lands, right? These are the lands east of the Anduin. These are the lands that are marked on the map as existing south of Mirkwood. When were the Brown Lands browned? When do they get all browned up? Well, we seem to think that it's, after the War of the Last Alliance. And the fact that they remain somewhat barren and hostile looking even at the end of the Third Age, when Aragorn and company are riding in their boats down the Anduin from Lothlorien, that is significant. It suggests that Gondor may have been protected in its earliest centuries, not just by fortune, not just by the valor of its men-at-arms, but by the very hostile environment south of Mirkwood that may have prevented Easterlings from threatening Calenarthon, from approaching the river, potentially. But here, in somewhat contradiction to that apparent fact, we're told that Northmen were invited and given broad lands south of Greenwood the Great. So who knows, right? The state of the Brown Lands is something that's always puzzled me a little bit. Maybe someone in the comments has picked up on something that I've missed, and you can correct me there. But I don't think that that we are supposed to imagine that the kings of Gondor gave the Northmen garbage territory right south of Greenwood. They must have found some lands that were worthy of inviting those men to live on and to act as that bulwark. So this is the first we hear of that bulwark. Again, we're not sure precisely when this begins, but it's certainly after Gondor had invaded eastward. And it's interesting as well that this is, in the context of Gondor's history, this presumably would occur before Gondor has fully expanded, right? So the height of Gondor's power is 1050. That is the flood tide. That is the year Hyar Mendikil the First invades, takes, I think he takes Umbar. He defeats the Haradrim anyway. And that's Gondor at its highest extent. You've seen the maps online, right? What does Gondor control? Well, all sorts of stuff, including this appendage stretching east towards the Sea of Rhûn. And at this point, Gondor already, even before Hyar Mendikil's day, presumably, Gondor already is somehow realizing that they're not able or willing to defend this eastern frontier themselves. So it becomes advantageous for them to have other men to do it, much like the dwarves, right? The dwarves have decided, well, okay, we don't want to control all of our trade routes on the surface. We need some other people to get us food. These guys are good with horses. Let's have them patrol, right? Let's have them watch the frontier. And it seems to be a nice arrangement for everybody involved for quite some time. So back to the quote here. So they gave them wide lands beyond Anduin, south of Greenwood the Great, to be a defense against men of the east. For in the past, the attacks of the Easterlings had come mostly over the plain between the inland sea and the Ash Mountains. That word mostly always stands out to me, right? Because it's easy to ignore that word and just say, okay, that's the way the Easterlings invaded. That's not quite what he says. Tolkien always leaves himself an out, right? There's always these hedges. Mostly, it is said, for the most part. It is believed. So he uses these words and phrases to leave open these other possibilities, which is very, can I say verisimilitudinous? Is there a word for that? It's very realistic is what I'm trying to say. This is the kind of thing that you would expect to see in an actual historical chronicle, right? Where the chronicler was maybe giving himself a bit of an out, maybe reflecting on or reflecting the fact that he did not know everything. He wasn't totally sure about this information, but he was passing it along as he understood it. So for the most part, the attacks of the Easterlings come south of the Sea of Rhûn, over that plain, and move westward. But that's not the only way. Where did the other attacks come from then? Well, I guess we could say north of the Sea of Rhûn, right? I don't think the Celduin was much of a barrier, although when we are told later that the Wainriders and others were driving Northmen up the Celduin does seem to be somewhat of a barrier there, right? So maybe there were passages along which an army could cross or peoples could cross in rafts, kind of like the Undeeps on the Anduin. But regardless, that could be another option, that Easterlings may sometimes have invaded around the northern end of the Sea of Rhûn and then down into what we would think of as Rhovanion today, crossing the Celduin at some point. Another option is through Mordor, but I think we have to discount that. I don't think that it's at all realistic or intended by Tolkien that we imagine Easterlings traipsing through what would be or had been Sauron's territory, right? That was defended by the men of Gondor at this point in the history, at any rate. So any mention of any defeat by the Watchers at Minas Ithil, for example, would certainly have been expressed in the Chronicles, I would think. Okay, so let's go back to the quote here, and again we're thinking about the year 1240. This is when Minalcar is taking over as regent from Narmacil I. And so it says, in the days of Narmacil I, their attacks began again, the attacks of the Easterlings, though at first with little force. But it was learned by the regent that the Northmen did not always remain true to Gondor, and some would join forces with the Easterlings either out of greed for spoil or in the furtherance of feuds among their princes. Minalcar, therefore, in 1248 led out a great force, and between Rhovanion and the inland sea, he defeated a large army of the Easterlings and destroyed all their camps and settlements east of the sea. He then took the name of Rhomendikel. So this would be Rhomendikel II, right? Fascinating couple of sentences there. First, we can observe the fact that the Northmen were not a solid block. They did not all act in concert. There was not one single unifying leader, apparently, or if there was, they did not all follow him. Some of them behaved in what seems, from the Gondor's perspective, a squabbling fashion, right? Fighting amongst themselves, allying with Easterlings to further feuds between their princes. Just, can you imagine, like, a story set in that period? How fascinating would that be if we had the glimpse of any characters of Northmen, like princes among the Northmen, who, and I think we can imagine that this is not very grand, right? This is not like the Grand Prince of Kiev or anything like that. These are probably maybe less sophisticated. Then again, maybe not, right? Gondor at the height of its power, around 1050 or thereafter, and we're talking about the 1240s, right? When they're squabbling with these princes. Maybe after a couple of centuries of dealing with Gondor at its height, the Northmen had grown quite strong indeed. And so maybe we could picture them as very wealthy, well-armed, and maybe as a consequence of being associated with that kind of wealth and that power, they had grown proud, right? Perhaps we can imagine them fighting for some sort of position, some title, King of Rhovanion, if you will, which we'll see shortly here. So it could very well be the case that we're dealing with a very advanced Northmen, but possibly not, right? Tolkien doesn't give us those details. But in any case, the fact that they could be hostile to Gondor is significant, especially when we consider that it is Minalcar himself, Rhomendikel himself, who establishes the Argonath, right? And he is the one who establishes it pointing north, right? Remember, Northmen, if you're coming down the river, that you're not gonna get past this, right? Okay, so Rhovanion sets out a great force, 1248, between Rhovanion and the Inland Sea, defeats a large army of the Easterlings. Okay, so where is that? Where is that battle? What between Rhovanion and the Inland Sea? I have no idea exactly what Tolkien means here by Rhovanion, right? He's describing Rhovanion as though it is a point on a map or a particular location. But as we've said, Rhovanion could be applied to territory basically from the Misty Mountains eastward to the Inland Sea of Rhûn. So it is impossible to tell precisely what he means. Presumably he means some point west of the Sea of Rhûn. Maybe he means somewhere in the middle between Mirkwood and the Sea of Rhûn. Somewhere in that area. He defeats a large army. The other fascinating thing about this particular paragraph, as we've read, it says that he destroyed all their camps and settlements east of the sea. Christopher Tolkien, when he was preparing the Unfinished Tales, and when he was dealing with this passage in the appendices, he was talking about this in the context of the Wain Rider Wars. And again, this is something you can find in Cirion and Eorl. That essay has a lot to do and to say about the Wain Riders, and so Christopher Tolkien felt that it would be useful to recall and refer back to the Appendix A passage that I've been reading from. And he found that turn of phrase, all their camps and settlements east of the Sea of Rhûn, he found that to be so surprising that he made a special note of it and suggested maybe what my father meant here was actually west of the sea, right? That would certainly be easier to fit and to countenance with this description of a campaign that started in Gondor, of course, moved into the territories of Rhovanion, and is described as taking place, that the significant battle is taking place west of the Sea of Rhûn. And so why would he then have destroyed all of their settlements east of the Sea of Rhûn? It does seem that if there were an argument to be made for a typo on Tolkien's part, or just a mistake, a slip, maybe this is it. Maybe he meant east to the Sea of Rhûn. Minalcar destroyed all the Easterling camps and settlements. Unfortunately, we don't know how to interpret that, because if we did, it would say a lot about the settlement in Rhovanion, the settlement patterns in Rhovanion and in other regions. For example, if Tolkien had written west of the Sea of Rhûn, Minalcar destroyed all of the camps and settlements of the Easterlings west of the Sea of Rhûn, that would tell us, okay, Easterlings settled west of the sea. They didn't just make camps, but they also made settlements, right? And that implies a permanence, a kind of arrangement with locals potentially, right? Because not only does it imply a conquest, but it implies we're going to move in, we're going to stay here for a while, and we're going to deal with the locals, just as we see the Easterlings do deal with local Northmen and sometimes ally with them. So if Tolkien had written west of the sea, we could then have this solid picture in our minds of Easterlings settling in the territories of perhaps eastern Rhovanion. And that would be an interesting image to have. But on the other hand, if Tolkien actually meant that what Minalcar did was he won this great battle west of the Sea of Rhûn, and then he proceeded eastward, maybe doing a great circuit of the Sea of Rhûn, kind of like, I think it was Agricola, the Roman general who circumnavigated Britain, was that correct? Just to sort of show off, right? We own this territory, we will punish you if you come in and start stirring up trouble with our allies and trying to turn them against us. If you come in and invade, we will destroy your armies and we will destroy your settlements. So he's going to make a great sort of chevauchée, if you will. We could imagine Minalcar moving south of the Sea of Rhûn, finding all the camps, destroying any stragglers, right? Moving then north on the eastern side of the Sea of Rhûn, doing the same, maybe finding some towns, some cities of Easterlings, who knows? And then sort of circling back around to the western side. If Tolkien, if that's what he had in mind, maybe, but we don't really know. It's kind of a shame. Regardless, we have some evidence of settlements and camps, presumably within not too distant reach of the Sea of Rhûn, at least on the part of the Easterlings. And we can say that the Easterlings and the Northmen were in contact in Rhovanion. And that indicates, again, something of the the diversity of the region in terms of the cultures and the populations that were there at the time. Okay, so let's move on. He took the name of Rhovanion after his great victory. On his return, this is where we get the Argonath mention. On his return, Rhovanion fortified the west shore of Anduin as far as the inflow of the Limelight, and forbade any stranger to pass down the river beyond the Emyn Muil. The Limelight is, I believe it's that river south of Lórien, right? That's the little river from the Misty Mountains coming down south of Lórien. And so he fortified the western banks of the Anduin up to that point. He it was that built the pillars of the Argonath at the entrance to Nen Hithoel. But since he needed men and desired to strengthen the bond between Gondor and the Northmen, he took many of them into his service and gave to some high rank in his armies. This sentence begins with the word but. And I find that another small clue to the nature of the relationship between Gondor and the Northmen at this point. We've just seen how Minalcar, on setting out on this campaign of 1248, becomes aware that the Northmen are not always true to Gondor. So what does he do? He leads out a great army, defeats a great host of the Easterlings, destroys their settlements. Right? He puts up a warning. He fortifies the Anduin. He puts a warning in the form of the Argonath. But he needs these Northmen. Right? He wants to get Northmen into his army. He wants to strengthen the bond between Gondor and this bulwark. So I think quite admirable, right, for a leader at this time to not simply throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, and punish the Northmen. I think Minalcar, now Rhovanion, is doing a very clever thing here. He's taking out a big army. He's finding ways to ally with local Northmen in Rhovanion. But he's also showing them in a very clear, decisive way. He's showing them the might of Gondor and what it will do to those who threaten it. And I think the Northmen in the area must have interpreted that message correctly, right? So although there must have been hostility, there was hostility at times between certain groups of Northmen and people of Gondor, this is a message not aimed at the Easterlings, right? Rhomanion's fortification of Anduin is not, again, primarily intended to keep Easterlings out at this stage because the bulwark of the Northmen of Rhovanion still exists. So he's fortifying Anduin to sort of show, okay, if you guys, Northmen, can't be trusted, just so you know, we've got forts on the west side of the Anduin. We've got a couple of big screw you statues, right, on either side of the river. And by the way, we just destroyed a bunch of camps and settlements of Easterlings and won a great battle in your territory, just so you know what we are capable of. So I find that a fascinating little bit of a politics on the part of Rhovanion II. Okay. This is also the beginning of apparently taking Northmen into Gondor's service. So post 1248, we can say that there are many, the word many is used. He took many of the Northmen into his service and gave to some high rank in his armies. And as you know from looking ahead into the history of Gondor, this could be the beginning of trouble, right? Beginning of trouble in the form of the kin strife. We won't get that far, but let's just move on a little bit further here. Rhovanion showed a special favor to Vidugavia. This is the first time we see that name, who had aided him in the war. So the War of 1248, Vidugavia is one of these leaders in Rhovanion, one of these leaders of the Northmen, who had helped Rhovanion or Minalcar beat that great army of the Easterlings, and maybe helped him in his circuit around the Sea of Rhûn, or if that's not what happened, helped him destroy those Easterling camps and settlements on the west side of the Sea of Rhûn. So who is this Vidugavia, who we're seeing the name for the first time? Well, to continue the quote, he called himself King of Rhovanion, and was indeed the most powerful of the northern princes, though his own realm lay between Greenwood and the river Kelduin. In 1250, Rhovanion sent his son Valacar as an ambassador to dwell for a while with Vidugavia and make himself acquainted with the language, manners, and policies of the Northmen. But Valakar far exceeded his father's designs. He grew to love the northern lands and people, and he married Vidumavi, daughter of Vidugavia. It was some years before he returned. From this marriage came later the War of the Kinstrife. Okay, so this is, an interesting point in Rhovanion II's, political maneuvering. On the one hand, I do think it's a good move of him to act as he did, militarily, politically, bringing Northmen into his armies. The one flaw, right, the one problem, which you could argue is not his fault, but is that his son fell in love, right? His son falls in love with a North woman, I guess we could call her. And so this, of course, causes the problem of the Kinstrife. We won't get into all of that. But I guess we can just say in passing that when Eldakar, who is the son of that union between Valakar and Vidumavi, Eldakar is half Gondorian, half Northman, right? He's the rightful heir to the throne. And when Castamir and the other rebels rise up against him and drive him out for a decade, he goes to Rhovanion. He goes back to the people of his father-in-law, the people of Vidugavia. So presumably, again, this bulwark, this area of Rhovanion, east of the Anduin, is still largely inhabited by Northmen, but there must have been some presence of Gondor among them, I would think. Some agents, some merchants, right? Some ambassadors, who knows? And now there's a court in exile, this 10-year period in which Eldakar lived, perhaps with Vidugavia. We don't know exactly how old Vidugavia is during any of this, but regardless, that must have been a very interesting time, because Eldakar would have taken with him, no doubt, many Northmen who had been taken into the armed forces of Gondor, but also, I would assume, several men of Gondor who were just loyal to him, not for any racial reasons, but simply because they saw him as the rightful king. That decade period of exile ends. Eldakar leads a great army out of Rhovanion, out of the north, and retakes his throne. We don't get the impression, however, that he makes a return trip, right? This seems to be, in other words, the end of the Kinstrife seems to be a net loss for the population and the strength of the Northmen who are in Rhovanion at the time. So it seems that in moving south to reclaim his throne, Eldakar would presumably have taken all the men he could of fighting age, and he would have rewarded them with lands, with titles, maybe invited other men to come and settle and work in Gondor. So the bulwark of Rhovanion that Gondor has by this time depended on for several centuries weakens further. After the end of the Kinstrife, however, I think we're looking at a relatively long, relatively stable period for the region of Rhovanion. There are still Northmen here, but one gets the sense that this frontier is no longer viewed as quite as important as the theater of the south, because in the aftermath of the Kinstrife, of course, we have the emergence of the Corsairs of Umbar, or of the Lordship of Umbar, a separate rival lordship that contests the power of the kings. We hear about wars with the Harad, we hear about wars against the Corsairs, various attempts to take Umbar back, various raids, and the last we hear about Rhovanion itself is in the context of the plague. So that's in the 1600s of the Third Age. The plague comes from the east, and in Cirion and Eorl, we are told that the Northmen of Rhovanion suffer greatly during that plague. Not that they lived together in large cities or anything, they did not, but we are told that they were gathered together during this period of intense cold, during this unseasonably cold winter, and in their low wooden houses, which housed not only their families but their animals, we're told that the plague took quite a toll on them as well as their horses. So this is again, the mid-1600s of the Third Age, and while there has apparently been peace of a kind, there's not been any significant military action in Rhovanion. The plague is, of course, a notable event, and we're told further in Cirion and Eorl that no doubt the Wayne Riders or other Easterlings would have attacked sooner, but for the fact that they were no doubt themselves suffering from this plague as well. I'm not sure quite what to make of that, right? I've always assumed that the plague was somehow associated with Sauron, who again at this time is not living in the east, he's living in Dol Guldur. But if Sauron had a grand plan to, assemble the Wayne Riders into this strong coalition and send them against Gondor, stirring up a plague seems to be somewhat at cross purposes with that, right? Stirring up a plague that would weaken the very population from which he was planning to draw his forces. So I'm not so sure exactly how we should read the plague, how we should read it as part of Sauron's, grand scheme. If it should just be seen as a sort of a somewhat natural event, I don't think so. I think for Tolkien, all of these events play some role in this cosmic drama, and we should interpret them as sort of as such. But I think the plague might have been one of those cases where Sauron maybe overplayed his hand a little bit or didn't see how things would all turn out. Regardless, the significance of the plague, I think, lies in the fact that for the Northmen of Rhovanion, many of their horses are killed. So a lot of their horses are killed. This is the first mention we have specifically that horses are important to the people of Rhovanion. This is the first mention of cavalry being important to Northmen since the Second Age, when we heard that they were gifted riders in their alliance with the dwarves. So we can assume, I think, that there's some continuity between the Northmen of the Second Age and the Northmen of the Third. And of course, that continuity will continue well into the Third Age and beyond. But I think what this also suggests is maybe an answer to the question of why were the Wayne Riders successful in their invasion. So to talk about that, let's sort of fast forward the clock to 1851. This is the year that the Wayne Riders emerged in Rhovanion. Right? They began in Appendix B. It says their assault upon Gondor begins, which I've always found to be interesting wording, because we tend not to think of Rhovanion as Gondor, but of course Gondor would have understood it as such. I don't think that we should picture like Gondorian troops manning a bulwark somewhere in Rhovanion, but nonetheless, there was a strong history of alliance with Rhovanion. Certainly after the Kinstrife, there may have been maybe an increased connection of kinship, or perceived kinship at least, even though there was no longer maybe as much activity passing between people in Rhovanion and people in Gondor. So Gondor certainly perceived Rhovanion as its territory. And so when the Wayne Riders attack in the year 1851, they are attacking not only Northmen as they had in the past, as we saw in the context of the 1248 campaign, but they're attacking Gondor as well, directly, more or less. And they succeed. And moreover, they're given 5 years to succeed before Narmekil II arrives to challenge them in 1856, the start date for the mod we've been talking about. Now, Narmekil II is a figure that I would love to know more about. He is king for only, 6 years total, right? We're told that his father, Telumetar Umbardakil, this is the man who took back Umbar in the year 1810 of the Third Age, took it from the Corsairs, destroyed the power of the Corsairs essentially, at least for that time. He dies in 1850, and so at that point, or shortly thereafter, his son takes over as Narmekil II. And I think that what I'd like to do, if I could put forward this interpretation of Narmekil II's character, is I would like to suggest as a hypothesis that, again, I would love to have some challenge to this, if you can think of a counter. But my hypothesis is this, that in Tolkien, names are important. And so when you see a Rhovendikil I and Rhovendikil II, obviously that is indicating some continuity of interest or achievement, right? But I think it might also be the case that when you see personal names, that maybe there is supposed to be an interpretation of continuity there as well. What do we know about Narmekil I? Not much, except that he is one of the childless kings, and he did not take an interest in the affairs of the realm. In fact, he basically hands aside rulership to Minalcar, who is not one of his sons, but I think a nephew or something like that. And Minalcar will be the second Rhovendikil. But Narmekil I seems to be one of these men in the tradition of Etanatar Alcarin II the Glorious, right? This is a man who loves ease, a man who is not as vigorous as some of the other kings of Gondor have been. And so therefore, maybe we can interpret Narmakil II in a similar way, right? Like Narmakil, who had illustrious ancestors, Narmakil II had a father who won a victory, a lesser victory, perhaps compared to some of the older kings of Gondor, but taking back Umbar was significant enough that in 1810 Telumnatar styled himself Umbardikill, Umbar Slayer, or Umbar Victor rather. And so Narmakil II has no achievements to his name, at least in that regard. And maybe he would had he not been killed in 1856, right? But regardless, he spends 5 years gathering an army, gathering a great army, we're told, and marching it north. There is that period of that 1 year, presumably, when, assuming that he takes over in 1850 sometime, there's the brief window of peace between the time when Narmakil II is crowned and the time when the Wainwriters invade in 1851. Maybe that's a period of a full year that he has. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's a few months. Maybe it's a few weeks. But regardless, from almost the beginning of his reign, the Wainwriters are invading. Now, I don't know how long it takes to assemble an army, but presumably in Middle-earth, it takes a while. It takes a considerable amount of time. So I'm not sure how judgmental we should be about Narmakil II. I'm inclined to be somewhat judgmental, simply because he failed, right? And maybe that's simply survivor bias, or just the fact that we know so little about him, that he's sort of an empty suit onto which we can project all sorts of things. But maybe, to be fair to Narmakil II, we could point out the history of Rhovanion I. Right, this is a king who took 10 years to throw out the Easterlings who invaded back in the late 5th century of the Third Age. So there's a decade in which Easterlings were evidently occupying parts of Gondor, and Rhovanion I had to assemble his forces and deal with them. It took him a decade to do that. Similarly, Eldakar, while he was in exile for a decade in Rhovanion, was not just sitting on his hands that entire time, right? So he must have been gathering his forces. And so, too, we could argue that maybe Narmakil II needed a time of recovery, needed a time to gather forces. We may ask, though, from where did he need to gather those forces? What was the crisis that he must have been responding to? Apart from the Wainwriters, right? Where were the armed forces of Gondor? If we can't blame Narmakil II for a delayed and ultimately ineffectual response to the Wainwriter invasion, maybe it might be appropriate to somewhat blame, if you want to call it that, the general decline in Gondor's fortunes over the centuries. Because while he assembles a great army, it's not up to the task, evidently. The closest thing that I can think of is that could provide some barrier, some problem, some shortage of manpower, right? The closest event that I can think of is the 1810 reconquest of Umbar by Narmakil's father. That's like 40 years in the past. So how long does it take to replenish an army, right? Imagine that there was heavy losses among Gondor's forces. What did Telumnatar Umbardikill do after that? Did he attempt to rebuild the armed forces? Did he not? Did he just let it go? Did he say, okay, we got Umbar, that's fine. We punish the Corsairs. Are we supposed to picture a Gondor that has just been simply beaten down by so many bad events, right? We've got the kin strife, that certainly costs a lot in terms of manpower. We've got the plague, which does a lot more. We've got these other events along the way, like various killings of kings, various other battles that occur. And then, eventually in its last gasp of expansionism, if you want to call it that, Umbardikill takes back Umbar, right? A settlement that had been in the possession of Gondor, many centuries in the past. But it's all that Gondor can do at this point, to summon like almost the last ounce of its strength to take back Umbar and beat the Corsairs. Well, however kind or harshly we want to judge Narmakil II, we can, very briefly just observe that he assembles an army that is said to be a great army, that he sends it north, that he marches north with his army, and that itself is not nothing, right? That's an indication of a man who at least believes in his cause, right? Is willing to fight for it himself. And along the way, he assembles various Northmen who are evidently still in the area. And this tells us something, I think, about what must be a fairly patchwork conquest on the part of the Wayne Riders. There's this idea, right, that you can detect in the Chronicles, especially in Appendix A, that the Wayne Riders were attempting to just assault Gondor and they want to overthrow Gondor. But the conquest of Rhovanion seems not to proceed quite like that to me. We're told in the aftermath of the battle of 1856 that the Wayne Riders, for their part, were content to complete their conquest of Rhovanion. Right? They did not press on. They did not attempt to cross the Anduin, although they could. They could have. They did not attempt to invade Ithilien, although they could have. Right? What was remaining to prevent them? The Battle of the Plains did not completely destroy Narmakil's army, although it did kill the king. Presumably there must have been some forces remaining somewhere in the country. But you get the sense that the Wayne Riders of Rhovanion, although themselves bloodied, they could have pressed that advantage had they really wanted to. Had they been, so hate-driven and so infused with the influence of Sauron, they could have chased the remnants of Narmakil's broken army back into Ithilien and wrought great havoc in the Ithil Vale, presumably, or the lower Anduin. But they did not. So it seems to me like this is the invasion of a people who is looking for land, looking for opportunity. And they find it in Rhovanion, which has suffered a great deal. Let's go back to that mention about the plague and the impact of the plague on the horses of the Northmen, because I think that is a clue as to why the Northmen failed. Now, we're told that the Northmen are a horse culture somewhat. Cavalry is important to them. In every single battle between the Wayne Riders and Northmen, at which Northmen are present, we have strong evidence of them fighting as cavalry. The only exception to this is the 1944 battle, and that's just chaos, right? The Wayne Riders invade far quicker than Gondor can predict, and so we don't know for sure if the Northmen present at that battle fought as cavalry, but they definitely did in 1856. They fought as a rear guard. The horsemen of Marhari, we are told, played a significant role in protecting the retreating army of Gondor. And in 1899, the cavalry of the Eotheod, who are also Northmen, of course, these are the Northmen of Rhovanion, they played a significant part in outflanking and attacking from the rear the army of the Wayne Rider, which was engaged with presumably the infantry of Gondor. So cavalry are hugely important to the Northmen. That should come as no surprise. They'll continue to be important in the days of Eorl, the days of Rohan, and beyond, presumably. But the fact that after the plague, their stocks of horses were so diminished, I think is one sort of reason, if we want to find sort of an explanation for this, why the Wayne Riders were able to roll in and presumably conquer piecemeal over the course of 5 years what had been conceived of as a bulwark for Gondor. Now, it is also said that the plague affected the Easterlings just as much, but I think we can also say that the Wayne Riders were not so cavalry-focused. Their chieftains fought in chariots, we're told. We're not told that there was tons of chariots throughout their armies, right? We're told that their chieftains fought in chariots. They traveled in great wains. That's about it. In 1944, there's lots of chariots, there's lots of cavalry. A lot of the cavalry comes from Khand in that battle, and we might suppose, therefore, that maybe Khand was out of reach of the plague, right? But regardless of that, if the Northmen, to whom horses are very important, had suffered a great loss of breeding stock in that winter, in that plague of the 1600s, could it be that they were just not able to replenish it? And maybe in the years of peace that followed, like relative peace, they saw no need. They saw that maybe they had lost some of their valor as horsemen, right, out of a lack of need or foes in the area. And so when the Wayne Riders roll up literally in 1851, they're finding that their horses, which are, I'm going to guess, worse than the horses of the Northmen, because to pull chariots, you do not need as big horses as you need to mount infantry, or mount cavalry, rather. So the horses, the ponies, whatever they were in the Easterlings that were pulling their chariots and those wains, may have been all that they needed. And otherwise, the Wain riders fought as infantry, right? And so losing a bunch of horses, maybe not as devastating to them. And so they were able to tip the balance and fight and win and hold Rhovanion. Now, the point that I want to make about Rhovanion in the aftermath of the Wain rider invasions is that if you read those accounts, you'll see that never are they expelled from Rhovanion. After 1899, which was probably the Northmen, the Eotheod's last best chance to take back their old homeland, they failed to do it, right? They failed, the revolt failed, the women and the old men and the youths who were left behind in the Wain rider encampment were able to essentially stop the rebellion of the slaves. And the losers of the Battle of 1899, the losing Wain riders, retreated northward, right? They were able to go back to the homes that they had stolen, regardless of the advice of the harrying cavalry of Marhuini, who taunted them and told them, "Fly east, not north, folk of Sauron. See, the houses you have stolen are in flames." They must have fled north regardless, because they did not leave. They remained there. We're told that in the lead up to the 1944 campaign, men gathered south of the Sea of Rhun. The Easterlings, the Eastern Wain riders, had a point of muster south of the Sea of Rhun, and to it came the armies of Khand, the warriors of Khand that had been summoned, as well as the Wain riders of Rhovanion. So they marched east before marching back west, which I find fascinating. And so although the Wain riders of Rhovanion after 1899 were in a much weaker state, no question, they nevertheless were still there. They were still somewhat threatening to the Eotheod, who were getting nervous in the 1940s about this new strength that they suspected was coming in from the east. After 1944, of course, the Wain riders' hegemony in the region dissipates. The Battle of the Camp, in which Eärnil storms the camp, sets fire to the Wains, and pursues them, fleeing out of Ithilien to die in the dead in the dead marshes. That's it, essentially, for the Wain riders as a political force. But their descendants live on in the east as well as in Rhovanion. And I think we have some very interesting, tantalizing evidence from the late Third Age to suggest what happened to them. So for this information, I'm going to the Return of the King, the chapter called The Steward and the King. This takes place after, after the War of the Ring, after the ring has been destroyed, Aragorn has been crowned. In the days that followed his crowning, the king sat on his throne in the Hall of the Kings and pronounced his judgments. And embassies came from many lands and peoples, from the east and the south, and from the borders of Mirkwood, and from Dunland in the west. All right, so look at this list. We've got from the east, from the south, borders of Mirkwood, Dunland in the west. 3 of those groups are absolutely, unquestionably enemies of Gondor. The east, the south, Dunland. What about that third group, right in the middle, from the borders of Mirkwood? I submit, again, hypothesis, happy to be challenged on this. I would submit that these groups, this embassy from the borders of Mirkwood refers not to the men of the Vales of Anduin, not to the men of Mirkwood, right, the woodmen who lived in small villages, but to Easterlings, descendants of the Wain riders and the later Balcoth, who remained in the region, as we've seen. And if we continue reading, and the king pardoned the Easterlings that had given themselves up, and sent them away free, and he made peace with the peoples of Harad, and the slaves of Mordor he released, and gave to them all the lands about Lake Nirnan to be their own. And there were brought before him many to receive his praise and reward for their valor, and so on. So what I'm suggesting here is that we have this group, these 3 different groups that are listed as embassies, and what Aragorn is shown doing here is pardoning his enemies for the most part. Right, he's dealing with his enemies. They're making deals. They're making arrangements for the new order of the world. Right, the new peace at which Gondor is not going to be bothered by the Easterlings, by the Southrons, by the Dunlendings. So it doesn't make sense to conceive of those peoples from the borders of Mirkwood as being allies, right? In the context of what's going on here, we're right in the middle of that list of enemies. I think we've got another enemy, and that is the peoples of the borders of Mirkwood are, if this is in fact the descendants of the Balcoth and the descendants of the Wainriders, then we have this fascinating split, if you will, between Easterlings on the one hand, right, embassies from the east, and then on the other hand, this group of descended Easterlings, which at this late date in history may have been mingled with Northmen, right? Who knows? And remains sort of as an independent entity, close and in fact within the former borders of Gondor, but a hostile party that nevertheless managed to preserve itself throughout not only the long centuries from the from when they first arrived as the Wainriders in the 1850s, but all the way to the very end of the Third Age and beyond, an independent group of Easterlings within the old bounds of Gondor. And it would be fascinating, if that is in fact the correct interpretation, to know just what arrangements Aragorn made with that group. At any rate, that's about enough for me. This has been a long video, so thank you for sticking with it if you have. Let me know what you think about any of these crackpot ideas in the comments, and as always, let me know if you have any questions about anything we discussed here or the mod. I'll see you in the next video. Take care, as always. Until then.